slovo. Tak já mám tu čest, abych představil našeho dnešního hlavního přednášejícího. Chtěl bych mu poděkovat, že tady v téhle nelehké době nakonec po těch všech peripetích, odkládání a tak byl pořád ochotný se naší akce účastnit. Joseph Grim Feinberg nyní působí jako vědecký pracovník v oddělení pro studium moderní české filozofie na Filozofickém ústavu Akademie věd. Mezi jeho zájmy patří český marxistický humanismus, dissent. V teoretické rovině se zajímá o politickou, kritickou, sociální teorii, témata jako nacionalismus, internacionalismus a podobně. Joseph dokončil doktorát v roce 2014 na University of Chicago. Vlastně nějaké jeho pracovní zkušenosti, kde jsme ho mohli vidět někde dříve, vlastně na počátku kariéry přednášel v Chicagu, působil také na univerzitě ve Vídni, potom pár let působil na Sociologickém ústavu Slovenské akademie věd a v současné době ještě kromě vlastně svého působení na Akademii věd působí jako externí přednášející na Ústavu politologie Filozofické fakulty. Josephovi se podařilo kromě nějakých takových standardních grantů a podobně získat dvakrát Fulbrightovo stipendium a publikačně byste ho mohli znát pravděpodobně asi nejvíce z monografie v roce 2018, která vyšla University of Wisconsin Press, Paradox Authenticity, která, což asi nebývá úplně tak časté, řekl bych, u podobných prací, zároveň vyšla i ve slovenském překladu, takže tady máme k dispozici vlastně dvojazyčné verze. Působí taky často v pozici editora různých knih, například k filozofii socialismu nebo další jeho editorské působení a překladatelská činnost je spojená s knihou The Windmills of Humanity, která vyšla v Chicagu. Samozřejmě kromě takových těch klasických věcí, které asi všichni v akademickém světě produkujeme, jako jsou různé odborné texty, které Joe je schopný dělat nejenom anglicky, ale taky česky a slovensky a docela často, tak byste ho mohli vidět i jako popularizátora, autora různých esejí, recenzí a podobně. Například třeba na rádiu Vltava byste ho mohli vidět. Také působí jako šéfredaktor časopisu Kontradikce, časopisu pro kritické myšlení a je spolueditorem edice Emancipace a kritika nakladatelství Filozofie. Tak tolik asi takový krátký exkurs našemu dnešnímu přednášejícímu. Já znovu, jak říkám, jsem velmi rád, že se k nám dneska připojil a pokusí se ve své přednášce načrtnout svou vizi toho, jak by spolu mohly souviset antropologie a filozofie, jakým způsobem by se nějak produktivně mohly ovlivňovat. Jestli jsou poslední informace správné, tak nakonec Joe, potom, co jsme se bavili, se rozhodl, že by přednášel anglicky, ale vzhledem k tomu, že je velmi fluentní vlastně v češtině úplně v pohodě, tak myslím, že asi by nebyl případně problém, pokud by třeba někdo na konci chtěl položit otázku i česky, to by asi jaký bylo možná předpoklad. Takže já předávám slovo. Děkuji.
Děkuji moc krát, Dané, za příležitost s vámi a vám, ale s vámi doufám, že bude nějaká interakce a tak mluvit, že budeme všichni moci diskutovat tyto věci. A ano, je to pravda, že jak jsem měl se rozhodnout, jestli budu hovořit anglicky nebo česky, jsem si řekl, že možná umím o něco elegantněji přednášet anglicky, takže budete mít o něco krásnější angličtinu, než byste měli češtinu, až začnu samotnou přednášku, ale rád budu diskutovat potom v jakémkoliv jazyku, pokud oba tomu jazyku rozumíme. Takže abych šel k věci. Ještě jednou děkuju. When Dan Sosna asked me to give this keynote, which was, as he mentioned, over a year ago now, just before COVID changed all our predictions about the world. I was at the time a little bit embarrassed because it's been about 7 years now since I was last affiliated with the Department of Anthropology. It's happened to pass that while I was writing up my dissertation, I had the opportunity to apply for a job at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences, as Dan mentioned, and for the first few years working there, I was constantly pressed by the embarrassment of being an anthropologist surrounded by philosophers, trying to prove to them that I could legitimately enter into debates about philosophy. I even added a philosophical chapter to the end of my ethnography. But now, after these few years, I'm starting to worry that I've been trying so hard to be a philosopher that I've forgotten my anthropology. But at the same time, I feel that I've been doing the same thing all this time, whether it was in the one field or the other field. And in fact, philosophy was the field where I first began my university studies. Already in high school, I fell in love with this daring attitude, asking big questions about the position of human beings in the world. During my last year of high school, still, I took an introduction to philosophy course at the local university, and I thought I was hooked. I had been given this taste of what reason and critique could do. There were these big words attached to big ideas, and I just wanted to have more and more of it. But after a couple of years studying philosophy at the university, I was disappointed for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. And then I turned to anthropology, not exactly because I stopped wanting to do philosophy, but more because I felt like I could do it better in anthropology. So I finished my bachelor's degree with a double major in philosophy and anthropology. And then I went on to get a PhD in anthropology. But somehow I did eventually come back to philosophy, and this was in part by chance, but in part I realized I think I was already looking for something else because I wasn't always quite certain if anthropology, in the way it was often practiced, was exactly what I hoped it could be. I wasn't, although of course anthropology is already doing plenty. That's the study of the human being. So there's little that isn't in some sense anthropological. And it was that bigness of the field that made me want to get into it in the first place, to be able to do whatever I wanted, I thought, within anthropology. But I also wasn't sure if disciplinary practices were always entirely up to the task that at least I had set for it when I got into the field. So I wasn't sure if it was ready yet, or maybe ready anymore, to seek answers to these big, all-human questions. Maybe just as an aside, I'll say, as Don mentioned, I did my graduate work at the University of Chicago, which really was, and probably still is, a department brimming with ideas, where doing anthropology was, in a real sense, a kind of path to philosophy. Students were expected from the start to have big ideas and use fieldwork to understand theory and to think theory and to do their own theory. So I don't know if we as individuals had more right to these big ideas, more right to this kind of confidence and daring than anyone else might have. But the institution encouraged us to exercise that right, and I do sometimes wonder what the discipline as a whole might be like if more people had approached it in that way, if more people felt from the start that they have the right to make big claims and then see if they are valid or not. But so for me, my return to philosophy felt like a natural development, but at the same time, I find myself repeatedly having to explain it to people who are curious about why, how it happened, how I manage it. And eventually I realized that those explanations aren't entirely uninteresting. And so this is what I decided to speak to you about today. How anthropologists can do philosophy, but also at the same time, how philosophy maybe should become more anthropological. So I don't want to just point to specific philosophical concepts that have made their way into anthropology, or specific anthropological concepts that have made their way back into philosophy. There are plenty of such examples. But what I really want to look at now are these two intellectual traditions as such. Now, this, of course, is a very, we could say, philosophical move that requires a good deal of hasty overgeneralization. So I will try to temper that overgeneralization with an anthropological attempt to place these fields in their unfolding social context and to ask what they have done and what they might in the future do. But first, I do want to point out what I think is a really important sense of shared purpose that anthropology and philosophy have, in that both are trying at a fundamental level to understand the significance of the human being in the world. And then they break this big question into many smaller, but still big questions. So at heart, they share this really ambitious impulse to universality. Both are founded on the idea that from our little places in the world, though we might be small people, part of small groups, in small societies, we can try to figure out what is really going on everywhere. There's nothing that humans do that's beyond the scope of philosophy or anthropology. And I think this is really remarkable when we compare it to other fields. Economists study the economy and more or less nothing else, which is to say they can study everything else, but only from the perspective of its economic functioning, insofar as those things are produced and distributed and so on. Literary scholars can write about anything in the world if it's been written in literature already, but only if. And thus they move beyond their discipline. Just focus on the mind. Historians look at the past. Even sociologists whose domain seems in many ways to overlap with the domain of anthropology, they tend to be more specific in their methodological outlook than anthropologists. They might look at anything done in human society, but the tendency is still to focus on specifically social, organizational, or what we sometimes call sociological aspects of what is done. And so when we speak of a sociology of art, this usually means that we're looking at how artists interact organizationally. But when we speak of an anthropology of art, it would mean simply that anthropologists are trying to interpret the full meaning of art beyond the specific field of art as defined by artists and art historians, and to look at art in the world as a whole. And that's more or less what the philosophy of art means as well. Now, so I've caricatured sociology a little bit. Sociology, of course, has also pushed its way beyond the traditional boundaries of the field, but also in doing so, it's adopted many of the methods of anthropology in the process and philosophy. And so I think still there's something to be said to this specifically anthropological tradition of approach to material. But at the same time, anthropology isn't known only for this kind of universalism. It's also known for its own kind of radical particularism. But still, this particularism of anthropology is a very specific sort of particularism, precisely because it's embedded in a claim to universalism. I think this comes from the idea that we can only understand the universal by trying to understand the great variety of particularities to go in it. So if we look back at, maybe not at the very first, the evolutionists like Tyler, who were much more, came more down on the side of making broad universalizing claims, but when modern anthropology, as we know it today, was founded by people like Boas, they had this idea that there is something similar, fundamentally similar to all human beings, but to understand that we need to really get into the details of what all different kinds of human beings are doing. So when anthropologists look at some universalizing generalization, they're often quick to point out all the exceptions to it. There's the infamous tendency to bongoism, as Mary Douglas called it. Say, whatever you said, it's all well and good, but among the bongo, it's different. But the premise that underlies this kind of approach is still that recognizing these exceptions should lead us to a better understanding of the whole. And this very scenario, in fact, in which a generalization is opposed to some remarkable and obscure exception, it can only take place within a field that already raises questions about the whole of humanity in the first place, is interested in all of these exceptions, not just in one kind of specific set of phenomena. This kind of interchange simply doesn't make sense in a discipline that's inwardly focused on one specific cultural context or social field. When I went to Slovakia for my fieldwork, Slovak folklorists and ethnologists would often ask me, they would often say to me, wow, so there are people in Chicago who are interested in Slovak folklore. That's interesting. I'm amazed that you studied that and you're studying that over there in Chicago. But my answer was always some variant of, well, no, not yet. There's not yet anyone in Chicago who's interested in this, but it's up to me to make them interested. And this, I think, is one of the things that makes anthropology different from the tradition of locally oriented ethnology or narodopis that emerged in Central and Eastern Europe, but also different from Western traditions of area studies. Because in anthropology, we don't expect our colleagues to work with the same particularities that we work with. Rather, we're interested in bringing these different particularities together to a big puzzle. The world is a big puzzle, a mosaic of all these different pieces. So it was perfectly normal for me, not that everyone did this, but it was not unusual for me to have a dissertation advisor who didn't specialize in my geographical region, but he was interested in the same questions, and we could speak together, knowing almost nothing about the same particularities of those cases, but knowing that we could ask similar questions and look for similarities from the differences in the answers we might find. So when anthropologists generalize, we expect to find our generalizations confronted by exceptions, and when we particularize, if I can coin that term, we do so in order to specify our generalizations, to explain differences, to demand and justify the inclusion of particularities in the whole. So we move from saying, maybe in some first instance, human beings do X. Then we realize that they don't always do X. So then we say, under these conditions, these people do X. And when those conditions change in this way, people do Y. Still a generalization, but a generalization that's been adjusted by this knowledge of specific differences. Now, I've been saying a lot about the human being as I explain what I think is central to the tradition of anthropology and philosophy. Since the question of humanism and anti-humanism and post-humanism has become a kind of heated question in anthropology, especially in light of the so-called ontological turn, maybe I'll say a few words on this. I continue to believe that the notion of the human being, anthropos, is central to anthropology and to philosophy insofar as it frees itself from pure generalization and recognizes its position in a socially differentiated world. But I don't think this requires us to take one position or another in the debate over humanism. Anthropology, in my view, is a question about human beings, to which humanism is one possible answer. So anthropology asks what the human being might be or might mean. Abstract humanism can say the human being is X. Abstract anti-humanism can say there's no such thing as the human being in general. Post-humanism can say, well, in effect, Homo sapiens is not the only kind of person in the world. The anthropos that we're looking at exists in a larger and more differentiated scale than we've tended to realize. So anthropology, as this tradition of inquiry, it can keep asking this question: under what conditions might the human being become or fail to become one or another idea about humanity? And it can arrive at multiple answers. So in other words, anthropology has really taken up with vigor the philosophical idea that was expressed in different ways by Hegel and Herder, that were already reacting to the exaggerated universalism of earlier Enlightenment philosophers like Kant. This idea that universality can only be reached through this detour, through potentially infinite moments of particularity. Unfortunately, I think philosophy has not always lived up to this idea. It's too often erred in favor of hasty universalism. Anthropology, meanwhile, sometimes becomes immersed in particularity and I think can lose sight of its fundamental impulse to universalism. Each discipline has its own reasons for this, and reflecting on those reasons might help us clarify the specific distinction, but also the connections between these two fields and how they might help one another, let's say. So in the next few minutes, what I'll be doing could be thought of as a kind of anthropology of philosophy, and following that, a philosophy of anthropology. I'll start with philosophy. True to form, I'll start with the big, old generalizations. Of course, every philosophical approach will have its own answer to the question of what philosophy is. But I approach the question as an anthropologist, which is to say, I try to identify a certain philosophy as a certain kind of cultural practice in a certain kind of cultural context. So this means that philosophy does not exist all the time, everywhere, but also that it's possible to identify something as philosophy in multiple times and places that may have even developed independently of one another. So that's another debate. So yes, this means making generalizations that could benefit from some specification. Of course, anthropologists know that people everywhere engage in abstract thought. People everywhere look for meaning in things around them and wonder about the nature of the world. But there are some situations in which people make this kind of inquiry into a distinct and consciously recognized genre of practice. So what did philosophy do to ideas? The Greek term for this practice is interesting, filosofia. It draws attention to the reflexivity of philosophy as a genre. So filosofia is the practice of people who love wisdom, the love of wisdom. But since just about everyone, in fact, loves wisdom in one way or another, what this really means more specifically is that philosophy is the domain of people who actively think about how they love wisdom and proclaim their love for wisdom by engaging in this practice of philosophy. This reflexivity, in turn, seems to have a few consequences. For one thing, the pursuit of what the Greeks called sophia, wisdom, it gradually becomes an autonomous activity. So philosophers develop the implications of one precept or another that they take to be essential to the pursuit of wisdom. And they might find then that the pursuit of wisdom can come into contradiction with other established and accepted attitudes. And so philosophers investigate these contradictions. As an autonomous, this kind of autonomous activity of philosophy, it seems to have emerged only under certain historical conditions. We could say ethnographic conditions if we were able to go back and reconstruct the cultural context in enough detail. So what a number of writers have pointed out, this remarkable coincidence that the first philosophers in ancient Greek, South Asia, and China, they seem to have emerged, their activities began at the same times and in the same places where coins began to be minted and exchanged. So money taking on material form. This is an argument very compellingly made by David Graeber in his book on debt, but it was also argued in the 1950s by George Thompson, a Marxist historian of ancient Greek philosophy, and even by George Lukács in the 1920s. The idea was suggested in some brief form. So all these writers, they suggest that the introduction of coinage disrupted older ways of thinking about the world, suddenly presenting people with a substance, a material substance that also seemed to be able to turn into anything, be exchanged for anything, rule over anything, lie under anything. And at the same time, it was so blatantly immoral in its effects that it demanded some kind of response. And so against this outrageous newcomer to society, philosophers began to propose other substances, other bases of nature and community that they thought were more adequate. But I also want to add to this picture what I think is crucial to the later fruition of philosophy, which is the rise of great empires, which gave this additional impulse to philosophers' universalism, which then became not only a logical principle that the world is composed of such and such a substance or operates by these specific rules, but it also became a human geographical principle that all people in the world might live together according to shared moral or political principles. This was often expressed as a protest against existing imperial orders, just as much as it could be used by empires to justify their expansion. So in other words, as these larger states were emerging in all the three main regions I've mentioned, out of earlier small, what the Chinese called warring states, many of the great philosophical systems looked at these empires and they asked, what would it take for these systems, which claim the right to rule over everyone, to really be justified in doing so? What ethical principles could these systems enact, if it were possible to do any at all, that would make their claims to rule legitimate? This autonomy of philosophical practice, then, this kind of inquiry, this kind of questioning, it also began to be recorded, sometimes in written books, but sometimes in this specific oral tradition that was institutionalized as schools of thought. And so this is how philosophy then emerges as a specific mode of communication or discourse, but also as a kind of socially organized practice. So as long as wisdom is pursued in full accordance with pre-established codes of ethics or belief, or if obtaining wisdom is ascribed to some unique personal experience or to otherworldly revelation, then we don't usually consider this to be the practice of philosophy. But if pursuers of wisdom claim to be working through the inherent logic of wisdom itself, if they ask, for example, whether the existence of gods can be reconciled with reason, whether the world really is the way it appears to be, then we can say that philosophy proper has come into being. These are questions that simply don't make sense in other contexts. So what modern Western tradition calls reason, it takes on a power of its own in this kind of situation, as it becomes an attempt to consistently apply the immanent principles of the pursuit of wisdom. Now this line of inquiry then, this application of something like reason, it typically leads to some kind of idea of opposing aspects of existence. On the one side of the divide, there's material that can be perceived by the senses, and there are beliefs that are taken for granted by traditional ways of thinking and by everyday experience. One side. On the other side of this divide, there's something that seems to be something that's not immediately noticed, something deeper, something that can only be reached through reflection, through reasoning, through analysis, through meditation. From here come some of the classic distinctions of philosophy. We have truth versus mere opinion, essence versus mere appearance, thinkable ideas versus matter, being, becoming, dharma versus adharma in South Asian tradition, heaven versus earth, which in Taoist and Confucian thought are the concepts of Tian versus Di. But it's not exactly that philosophy necessarily takes one side over the other, truth against opinion, or being against becoming. First and foremost, philosophy is characterized by this concern with the tension between these terms. So what this can mean is to do what philosophers like Parmenides and Plato and many later Christian philosophers would do, which is to radically emphasize truth, ideas, ultimate being, God, and to denigrate merely human society with all its imperfections. So this, in its most radical form, can lead to a withdrawal from the world, a withdrawal from all empirical events and happening. And this is a move which obviously takes us very far from the practice of anthropology. But the reason I am getting into this distinction here is that it can also move in a second direction. When philosophy turns its critical impulse toward the social order, and rather than withdrawing from the world, it can call for reforming the world. This can mean rendering the human community, reordering the human community to resemble the ideal principles of pure philosophy. This is one approach. But it can also mean rejecting imposed ideas about the gods or given moral hierarchy. Can mean rejecting established elites' unfounded claims to the truth. And we have ideas like the South Asian notion of enlightenment or liberation, moksha, or the East Asian notion of the way, the Tao, which suggests a kind of process of arriving at truth or escaping falsehood, which isn't based on access to specific substantive truth, but is process whose results might differ at different moments, depending on the configuration of forces at that time. And so I emphasize this because this contestation of truth and its application to worldly affairs then can develop branches of what became known in the Western tradition as ethics and political theory, which then again in the Western tradition would give birth to social science, and from there to anthropology. And even in very empirically oriented social science, many of these old philosophical distinctions remain, not just in dualism between matter and ideas, which is debatable whether we want to maintain that or not, but also, for example, in debates over whether pure observation and the collection of positive facts is sufficient to empirical research, or if social scientists should be looking for deeper patterns, structures, laws, and so on, which aren't immediately apparent to uncritical observation. This is a fundamentally what I'd call philosophical kind of approach to material, to look for something that's not immediately apparent, but that's also not accessible through some kind of divine revelation or purely personal experience, but is reached through a kind of analysis or reasoning. So what I'm trying to set up here is that philosophy introduced this systematic calling into question of things that were previously accepted. But at the same time, this questioning attitude is repeatedly undermined in the philosophical tradition by an emphasis on truth and eternal being, which threatens to fix philosophy in place and to turn its claims into dogma or creed. And I think it is noteworthy that the same societies that produced critical philosophy also produced some of the first systematized dogmas and creed. It's as if one needed to be balanced by the other. So in most of world history's spiritual traditions, it's expected that belief and allegiance will vary from person to person, from community to community. People might fight over whose God or whose spirit or whose totem is the best, but not over whose is the truest or whose is the only one that exists. Even in much of the Hebrew Bible, this is the attitude that dominates. Yahweh is not depicted there for the most part as the only existing God demanding faith, but as one God who demands the allegiance of his specific people. So it was above all the Christian tradition that drew on Greek philosophical claims to truth that established the idea that everyone in the world should believe the same thing. But in China, we can observe a parallel development, not towards ontological dogma, but towards the establishment of Confucianism no longer as one competing school of thought among others, but as a definitive, authoritative code of ethics and comportment, and a system of established ritual to be followed, in contrast to the contention among multiple schools and multiple alternative possible rituals. So maybe there is an element of philosophy that tends to undo itself as philosophy if it isn't countered by some other principle that prevents this truth from becoming absolute, fixed truth. So this is where I turn to philosophy, from philosophy to anthropology. Now, the origins of anthropology are, of course, better documented and easier to situate historically than the origins of philosophy. Again, it's a story of money and empire, this time modern capitalism and the extractive colonial regimes that it set up. We know that the first anthropologists wouldn't have studied societies all over the world if they hadn't lived as relatively privileged members of colonial groups that were interested in knowing about the people over whom they ruled or hoped to rule. But like philosophy earlier, anthropology also developed into a critical approach towards the same society that made it possible, specifically a critique of the false universalism claimed by modern empires. Anthropology then was able to see the abstract universalism of the Enlightenment, which had been mobilized as a justification for colonial rule. It was able to see that this was just one particular system of thought among others. Or to put it somewhat crudely, anthropology could say that no universe is complete if it doesn't have a place for people like the bongo bongo. For this, the least well-known among them needs to have a place in this system if it's going to really be universal. And this became one of the great intellectual strengths of anthropology. It could contextualize and, in a sense, socialize ideas that presented themselves as existing all the time and everywhere. So I'm very sympathetic to Tim Ingold's expression that anthropology is philosophy with the people in it. But I might also put a twist on it to say that anthropology puts philosophy into the people by situating ideas in society and recognizing them everywhere. This is implied by the anthropological concept of culture, which itself emerged in large part by contextualizing and socializing the older German philosophical concept of Kultur, which had called for cultivation of certain ideas, but hadn't fully acknowledged how these ideas were situated in a specific society and only became important to cultivate because that society was structured in a certain way. So by opening itself up like this, anthropology made its material, in some sense, bigger than the material available to philosophy. Of course, philosophy thinks that it's thinking about all of existence or all of being, but it thinks first and foremost with ideas that are already given by other philosophers. So anthropology then instead, in principle at least, opens itself up to all ideas, large or small, and sets for itself the task of seeking out ideas that go unnoticed, ideas that seem unimportant, and it tries to show how these ideas might really be significant after all, without a priori privileging certain ideas, or the ideas of one context over another. So one of the great features of anthropology is that it can, in effect, make any idea philosophical. It can take an idea that's been taken for granted, and it can question it. It can analyze its meaning. It can take that idea out of one context, hold it up against another idea from another context, for the sake of comparison, for the sake of tracing historical development. And then it can bring this idea into conversation with other ideas, make the one into part of an argument with another, and so on. So it can reach beyond the limits of the tradition of philosophy as a specific tradition. It can take ideas that haven't entered into philosophical discourse and bring them in. And anthropology can then ask, for example, it can draw out principles implied in some ideas that maybe previously have always been thoroughly embedded in contexts and people involved in them haven't logically tried to look at the contradiction or imminent implications of this one idea as such. Anthropologists can, for example, take something like the concept of mana, or the concept of how, and place it alongside philosophical concepts, turn them into potentially universal ideas for an understanding personal power in the case of mana, or the compulsion to give gifts in the case of how. Of course, anthropology also tends to be circumspect when it comes to making claims about universal validity. So claims like this remain only claims. They can be contested, specified, placed back in one or another local context. And this is part of the process of reaching towards a universalism that could be anthropologically valid without claiming prematurely that it's already become universal. So I think anthropology should remember how much it has to contribute to philosophy, not just borrow ideas from philosophers, but also become philosophical in its own respect. It can introduce new ideas into philosophical discourse. It can, and we can see how this kind of gesture has been crucial to a number of modern movements that have established or reclaimed non-European intellectual traditions as philosophical. So while I think there is a difference between self-conscious philosophizing on the one hand, and the implicit uncodified metaphysics or ethics or politics that are contained in cultural traditions everywhere, though there is a difference, what modern movements have been able to do, especially in the course of decolonization and anti-colonial movements, has been to recognize that there is a wealth of ideas that can be made philosophical when brought into explicit, autonomous, cultural, critical reflection. Anthropology also shares with philosophy the ability to defamiliarize accepted concepts, but it has other tools at its disposal that philosophy doesn't always have or make use of, like the ethnographic ability to put ideas, put pure reason in its place, confronting ideas with the messy stuff of the world and human practice. So I think anthropology then, in this respect, can help prevent philosophy from becoming ideology, in the sense that Marx wrote in his early critique of the young Hegelians, or when in his thesis on Feuerbach, Marx simply writes, the philosophers. But the philosophers have engaged in all these critiques of critical criticism, but they haven't recognized that criticizing ideas with other ideas still remains within the realm of ideas. What anthropology does is it puts those ideas into society, makes them a form of social practice. I think the distinction between the emic and the eidic that anthropology has, it's also a tool that could be of important use to philosophy, which often needs to be reminded just how emic, how embedded in culture its own ideas are. But at the same time, I also think, I'll get more into what I mean later, I think that anthropology does itself a disservice by employing the emic-eidic distinction too often and too strictly, because in doing so it risks closing itself off from ideas that are only emic. If it only allows itself to employ terms that are pre-established as acceptable analytic or eidic terms, then it risks bringing back this kind of distinction between the terms that are, say, philosophically, universally, analytically valid, and other terms that are just objects of research. So I think anthropology can fulfill its own promise of intellectual openness by admitting the kind of porousness between the emic and the eidic, the possibility that any term could become edict could be placed on the plane of discussion with other terms. Other theoretical discourse could be used as terms of analysis. But now, getting back to what anthropology can do for philosophy, I also think that by placing ideas back in society, back among the people, putting the people in them and putting ideas into the people, anthropology can help philosophy break out from what I like to call the cult of philosophical personalities. Anthropology, after all, has some experience analyzing the phenomenon of big men and the phenomenon of ancestor worship. It should be able to recognize them when it sees them and to call them out. Too often, philosophy gives way to a kind of ritual defense of great men who came before us. And even if ancestor worship might sometimes serve justifiable social functions, I think it hardly lives up to the role of radical questioning that, in my view, defines philosophy as a specific mode of thought. So anthropology, by showing that all ideas can be made philosophical, it also holds out the promise that all people can become philosophers, which means us too as researchers. It's strange to say, but in my experience, the discipline of philosophy is one of the most difficult places today to find someone actually engaging in philosophizing. The cult of philosophical personality is so strong that it's practically become taboo for any mere mortal among us to presume to have real philosophical ideas. So, if you conduct research in a department of anthropology, people call you an anthropologist. If you conduct research in a department of philosophy, you're still just a researcher of philosophy. Who is really a philosopher? Who's ever seen a philosopher? They exist in books, or maybe someplace in Paris or some university in Italy, but it's really outside of philosophy as a discipline. In fields like anthropology, not to mention the popular philosophers of bar rooms who don't respect an academic protocol, where people, mere mortals, dare to engage in philosophy. So I think that impulse is, to my mind, a powerful one that can contribute to the tradition of philosophy and sometimes even rescue it from the specific academic discipline of philosophy. But at the same time, I'm still of the opinion that anthropology has a great deal to gain from philosophy, if not always from the academic discipline so named, then at least from philosophy as a genre of intellectual practice, wherever it's maintained. For one thing, philosophers, though not always researchers of philosophy, they can be rather good at coming up with new concepts, which then anthropology can take over as its own. But I don't really want to focus on this application of specific concepts. What I think is more interesting is how philosophy offers a kind of method that anthropology can build on. Philosophy, first of all, depends on a careful balance between specification and generalization, which is crucial to anthropology and its ability to address a broad audience, both academic and non-academic, but which I think is sometimes overlooked. As I mentioned earlier, if philosophy often errs on the side of excessive generalization, I think sometimes anthropology gets lost in specificity. I was thinking about one time when in college, before a philosophy class, one of my classmates just observed for over some conversation. He said, "Isn't philosophy the art of making generalizations?" And the professor replied, after reflecting for a moment, I like to think of philosophy as the art of making distinctions. The thing for me is that both are true. This dual impulse is crucial to the plausibility of philosophical claims, and it's equally useful to anthropological analysis. So for any fact that we come across, we can ask, is it generalizable? And at the same time, we can ask, how does this fact differ from all other facts? It occurred to me to call this the Passover Principle. At a Passover Seder, the youngest child at the table is supposed to ask, how is this night different from all other nights? And the adults sitting around the table are compelled to explain the whole symbolism of the event. There's a bowl of salt water, which they explain. This represents the tears of the Israelites when they were slaves in Egypt. There's a bitter herb on the plate, horseradish usually. This represents the hardship of the slaves laboring. There's unleavened matzah bread. This represents the need to flee quickly from the oppressors. We eat reclining, and this is a symbol of the freedom that we've won so with so much struggle. These specific things are used to explain the narrative of the entire course of a people's history. This one unusual night points to a meaning that's contained unseen in all other nights, and it can do so precisely because it's different. It reminds us that this one moment is part of a big story, which repeats itself every year, but it repeats itself also in repeated cycles of history, and then it can even escape the specific cultural context of one people that first started telling the story, and it can be presented as a symbol of all human liberation. So I think we can look in every moment for that element that transcends that moment. We can ask how the specificity of that moment enables it to transcend itself. We can see how this night is generalizable by virtue of its difference from all other nights. I also bring up this principle because I think it should help us guard against the idea, which I've heard what I think is too often in anthropological circles, admittedly, especially in those immersed in the kind of Anglo-American notion of intellectual populism, that goes to something like the idea that theoretical stuff and abstract stuff is inaccessible to the public. And the way to speak to a broad audience, the way to popularize, is to limit ourselves to very concrete cases. I think the Bible that I just went into, it's hardly an unpopular book. I think it could only have become the bestseller of world history if it weren't only a concrete case study of one small group living between Egypt and Babylon in some obscure location, but it was able to become popular because it took concrete events and gave them abstract meaning. It took one's old claims that could be other people's story. And I think speaking to broad audiences requires that we have this kind of chutzpah to ask big questions. Of course, the trick is to ask the right questions. The questions I ask in this audience, the questions I ask colleagues in the philosophy department won't be the same big questions, but they might not be any bigger than the questions that some broad audience of the non-academic public might want answered. So I just think this is a bit of a false dichotomy between what's popular or accessible and what's theoretical. Really, I think people only understand and care about something if it's in some fundamental sense theoretical. And this is especially true for a field like philosophy, a field like anthropology, that most of the time presents people with empirical cases that are completely unfamiliar to them. We can't take for granted that someone in Prague cares at all about a small island in the South Pacific, for example. But we can explain to them how this unfamiliar case relates to familiar cases elsewhere in the world. And we can show them why it's interesting, why, in fact, really big questions can be answered in this way. So this is what I had to do in convincing people in Chicago that Slovak folklore mattered to them. And then in another way, convincing Slovak folklore performers that maybe the things that they took for granted, they didn't bother to think about, these familiar cases were also interesting because they were maybe not something to be as much taken for granted as necessary. Again, by bringing it out of this concrete context and making something generalizable about it. So this brings me to the relationship between philosophy and stories as another point as I come close to my conclusion. A story can be implicitly theoretical insofar as it points to meaning beyond specific facts. And this is essential to what any good story does. It's not told just because people want to learn the facts. Those are things when we tell sometimes histories, or we simply give people information and news. But when something is told as a story, you can tell me a story about a completely fictitious set of people that never existed, and I don't believe they ever existed. But it matters to me because it's about something else. And philosophy, generally speaking, though it involves usually a different mode of presentation, in a similar way, it points beyond the specific towards something general. But also philosophy and storytelling come together in many ways that we don't always notice. I don't mean this only in the case of philosophers like Voltaire or Sartre, who wrote literature, wrote stories, but even in strictly philosophical texts, there's a narrative that opens a problem that we want answered. It shows us how the material, the story, answers this question. To take one example, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is really a great story about how abstract spirit passes through multiple levels of concrete reality until it reaches its final goal and the grand resolution at the end of the book. It's not everyone's preferred literary genre, perhaps, but this is why the book became so compelling, much more compelling than if it were simply a set of positive assertions. It tells a story, and this is why it becomes effective as a work of philosophy. What I'm getting at here is that there's also something about this, something that ethnography can do very well and has a big advantage in being able to do. Since although much of the material of an ethnographic story is different from what a typical philosophical treatise tells, ethnography, in order to reach its audience, reach a broad audience, answer big questions, it does have to tell a good story in some sense. And so these are a few of the ways that I think anthropology can take some cues from philosophy and from, say, philosophizing literature and various literary traditions that point beyond the specific towards some kind of generality. By pushing us to ask big questions, they can push for us to look for big answers. And I'm convinced that anthropology does have the tools to provide those answers, even if they might be tentative. They might be generalizations that are still in search of exceptions, exceptions that are in search of newer, more specific generalization. And I hope that you'll take the generalizations I've made here in this admittedly brash way as hasty reflections, but still also I hope to make the case that there's some value in reaching past what appears first before us, reaching into material, and trying, even at the risk of sometimes overreaching, to find something universal, or something that reaches towards the universal in all the little differences that we encounter. So I will end it there, and thank you again. Děkuji.
Takže já si s dovolením teďka asi vezmu slovo. Děkujeme moc za přednášku. Myslím si velmi zajímavou. Řada věcí nám asi zůstane v hlavě ještě nějakou chvíli a můžeme nad něma přemýšlet. A teďka bych se žádné vyloženě psané komentáře tady zatím nevidím, ale podíváme se na účastníky. Jestli pak někdo se hlásí. Zatím nevidím, všichni se evidentně stydí. A Tomáš Samek, tak Tomáš, já bych tě poprosil, jestli by si položil otázku.
Tak děkuju moc. Já jsem jako klasicky česky nechtěl být ten první, ale když se nikdo nehlásil, tak jsem zase nechtěl, aby to dopadlo klasicky česky, že se nikdo na začátku nehlásí. Takže já moc děkuju Joe za ten velice podnětný a hluboký diskurs, který si tady předvedl na téma, který je strašně zajímavý, a já vlastně musím říct, aniž bych chtěl příliš dlouho mluvit sám o sobě, že ho vlastně dennodenně zažívám jako člověk, který se octnul na katedře, kde spolu žijí dohromady lidé dělající společenské vědy a filozofii, a dokonce to je přímo v názvu té katedry. A jest mi komunikovati přes tuto hranici skoro každý den nebo aspoň týden, a je to nesmírně obtížné, takže já jsem prostě s velkým zájmem poslouchal reflexe člověka, který vlastně v nějakým způsobem díky profesní dráze své řeší více nebo méně podobná dilemata. Takže jako opravdu velmi, velmi podnětné. Myslím si, že bych k tomu i mohl dodat jakoby spoustu zcela konkrétních dialogických a konverzačních námětů, které by jakoby dokumentovaly platnost těch tezí, které zde zazněly, ale říkám, tohle není moje přednáška, mělo by to spíš směřovat k dotazu. A mě tak jako napadá vlastně, když tak poslouchám toho, o čem jsem taky sám dlouho jakoby přemýšlel, že totiž jedním z těch aspektů, který je klíčový pro vztah mezi filozofií a antropologií nebo obecně společenskými vědami, je prostě vztah mezi partikularismem a univerzalismem. A vlastně jako lingvistický antropolog, to je vlastně jako něco, co je náš jakoby denní chleba, co my řešíme neustále, protože jaksi velká, mohutná a vám všem určitě velmi dobře známá lingvisticko-antropologická tradice, která se tázá na to, co v našich komunikačních projevech je nějakou, řekněme, univerzální, nebo co, řekněme, spadá do sféry, kterou lze označit jako psychickou jednotu lidstva. A naopak, co spadá do sféry nějaké partikularity, která je třeba nějakým způsobem spolupodmíněna kulturně a lokálně a tak dále, kteráž to potom už sféra nemůže jaksi kandidovat na ten status té univerzality. Jo. A tak mě vlastně jakoby napadá, že že ta filozofie tím, že vlastně sama neustále jakoby zdůrazňuje, jak její jako nároky, výsledky práce a tak dále jsou jako univerzální a univerzalismem vstupující do dialogu. A naopak v antropologii velmi často, když někdo vyřkne nebo napíše do nějakého odborného článku něco trošku univerzalistického, tak je hned klepnut přes prsty. Jo. To jsou vlastně dvě velmi odlišný v tomhle smyslu zcela kontradiktorický disciplinární tradice, jakkoliv platí to, co si Joe říkal, že vlastně v každém univerzalitě je spousta partikulárního a naopak v každém partikulárním zrnku písku lze nalíst celý univerzální vesmír. Jo. Ale a ono to potom vede k tomu, že se vlastně ty disciplíny i nějakým způsobem specializují. Že vlastně ta filozofie jakoby hodně lpí na těch věcích, které se týkají toho, co jsem předtím pracovně nazval psychickou jednotou lidstva. A vlastně tak jako hlíží s nedůvěrou na všechno tu partikularitu, která tuhle ten princip obklopuje. A naopak my antropologové milujeme jako všechen ten bordel, který zbyde, když se vyzobají ty univerzalistické hrozinky a my se prostě rádi díváme na ten odpad toho partikulárního a přebíráme tam, někteří z nás mají dokonce odpad jako vlastní specializaci své práce a jako rádi v tom vyzobáváme, jako prostě díváme se na úplně jinou perspektivu. A já se vlastně jako chci zeptat na to, jestli je vůbec zájem jako v jednom nebo druhém oboru jako o vlastně tu druhou stránku té věci, protože říkám, já s tím dennodenně jsem v kontaktu spolu s kolegy a s kolegyněmi, kteří nejsou společenskými vědci. A ten dialog je nesmírně obtížný. Jo. Čili to je jedna věc a potom druhá otázka, omlouvám se, že jsem to možná uváděl až příliš dlouho, ale na to spolu všechno souvisí. A ta druhá otázka je, ty jsi se jako Joe moc nezmínil o tom, o filozofické tradici, která je známá jako analytická filozofie. Jo. A která ale vlastně docela dost intenzivně v některých svých okrajových polích komunikuje právě třeba s lingvistickou antropologií. Takže jestli bys třeba mohl ještě něco říct o vztahu nebo o tom, jakou roli v celé té problematice, kterou jsi zde nastínil, by hrála nebo mohla hrát analytická filozofie, protože my jsme trošku moc zabředlí do toho jako kontinentálního pojetí té filozofické tradice. Tak děkuju. Doufám, že to bylo jasné. Já jsem tam byl dost dlouho a krkolomně, a kdyby to nebylo jasné, tak se nějak doutej.
Budeme sbírat otázky, nebo mám hned reagovat?
Připadlo by mi možná nejlepší reagovat rovnou, jestli je to možné.
Dobře, no, tak děkuji moc krát, Tomáši. Jestli je zájem o sblížení mezi obory, já bych řekl, že z principu je vidět poměrně velký zájem, ale říkám z principu. Ne vždycky, neprojevuje se to vždycky v praxi. Myslím, že vidíme v dějinách filozofie, že hodněkrát nějaký nový směr vznikl právě proto, že kritizoval předešlý směr za to, že byl příliš univerzalistický a si neuvědomil, že jak jsem zmínil Hegela nebo Herdera, že ten předešlá snaha o univerzalizaci nebyla dostatečná, protože nebrala v úvahu partikularitu a tak se snažili nějak vzít do obrázku mnoho víc toho materiálu. A vidíme to opakovaně v nových směrech, které jiným způsobem se snaží nějak tak argumentovat, že ze třeba fenomenologie se snaží říkat, že vlastně každodenní praxe nebo zakoušení v životu musíme to umět filozofovat taky, brát jako věc filozofie. Ale zároveň myslím, že právě tento impuls partikularizační je často uvnitř filozofie zase nerealizovaná. Vidíme, třeba fenomenologie začala s tím impulzem, že chce být velmi partikulární, ale hned začala zase velmi rychle univerzalizovat a vymyslet nějaké velmi velké pojmy jako autenticita nebo péče, nebo tak, které se uplatňuje hned na celé lidstvo bez nějakých konkrétních případů. Takže a myslím, že i můžeme sledovat dále. Že právě proto bych řekl, že filozofie jako samostatný obor se neukázal jako schopen úplně realizovat vlastní principy. A možná právě proto je dobré, aby byl ten impuls zvenku, například od antropologů, aby filozofie aby dělala to, co chtěla dělat. Vlastně já jsem to, co mě během univerzity podnítilo k tomu, abych nechal filozofii a začal dělat antropologii, byl právě čtení Heideggera a Derridy. Ale zejména Derridy, protože Derrida přišel právě s tím, že analyzoval sociální antropologii, používal koncepty od Maussa a myslel, že už dělá že analyzuje společenské kulturní pojmy, ale analyzoval jako filozof, který dekonstruuje nějaké argumenty druhého filozofa. A vůbec mi přišlo, že nepochopil, co je společnost. A jsem myslel, že vlastně filozofie by měla pochopit, jak ty ideje se pohybují ve společnosti. Tak to je jedna strana a myslím, že z druhé strany od antropologů zase vidíme velmi často, že je snaha odpovídat na ty velké otázky, ale zase, a možná právě protože se setkáváme často s konkrétními filozofickými snahami, které jsou hned tak univerzální, že neumíme je hned jasně uplatnit na konkrétní materiál, že to odpuzuje antropologii, ale myslím, že vlastně antropologie může se snažit využívat svoje vlastní nástroje, aby našel lepší nebo adekvátnější koncepty, než vznikají z jednostranného univerzalizačního projektu. K druhé otázce o analytické filozofii musím si přiznat, že nejsem analytickým filozofem, ale možná jeden z důvodů je, že jsem vždycky měl pocit, že přestože analytická filozofie velmi často využívá specifické koncepty, které přebírá třeba z lingvistiky nebo ze sociologie, z kulturní antropologie občas. Přijde mi, že nemá dostatečné chápání své vlastní historicity. Že vlastně to kontinentální filozofie aspoň je snaha, že když někdo studuje kontinentální filozofie, studuje dějiny těch myslitelů, ne úplně dějiny ideí ve společnosti, ale aspoň jak vznikaly ty ideje v času. A analytická filozofie prezentuje ideje velmi často, jako kdyby existovaly čistě jako analytické koncepty, které se aspoň na tento moment uzavorkujeme ten dějinný vývoj ideí. A pro mě to pro mě je to problém, který zpochybňuje samotnou možnost univerzalizovat těchto konceptů, protože je to příliš rychle ta snaha hned mít univerzálně využívatelné analytické koncepty. Ale zase, to já říkám jako univerzalizace, která není pravda u všech analytických filozofů.
Já moc děkuju, omlouvám se, že trošku nezdvořile vstupuju, čas nám běží, takže já bych si dovolil, přihlásil se tady potom Nikola Baláš, takže Nikolo, jestli...
Dane, děkuju. Pokud teda tady ještě mělo něco zaznít, tak klidně pokračujte, jo? Já bych se to zase nerad takhle vlamoval. Chci se přidat k tomu, co říkal Tomáš Samek, mně se to moc líbilo, mě totiž filozofie taky svým způsobem oslovuje a považuji ji za něco podstatného. Ta přednáška mi vlastně připomněla to, co říká Pierre Bourdieu na několika místech ve svém díle, že on chtěl vlastně řešit filozofické otázky, ale filozofické nástroje k řešení mu nepřipadaly dostatečně dobrý, tak právě chtěl použít nástroje sociálních věd na řešení filozofických otázek. Takže ta přednáška svým způsobem ve mně rezonuje. Stejně jako Tomáš Samek souhlasím s tím problémem komunikace, protože jako Tomáš Samek na peďáku má profesorku Hogenovou, tak vy máte zase archiviana Patočky, kde prostě komunikace mezi já jsem jako párkrát zažil komunikaci s nima, sociální věda a jejich fenomenologie, to jsou dva prostě úplně odlišní diskurzy, kde najít nějaký prostě společnou řeč je hrozně těžký. Takže tady v tom ohledu bych byl skeptický. A mám jednu takovou otázku, která se týká vlastně té univerzality. Tady během té přednášky hrozně často zaznělo, že jako hledáme nějakou univerzalitu. A není to tak jako spíš naopak, že my tu univerzalitu potřebujeme už jenom k tomu, abychom učinili nějaký třeba partikulární tvrzení? Jo. Jestli jako ta univerzalita vlastně nemá tak trošku jiný status, než jak jste to podal vy ve své přednášce. Díky.
No to je velmi dobrý podnět. Já bych řekl, že oboje. Na jedné straně myslím, že antropologové od začátku a do dnes máme určité cíle, které jsou svým způsobem univerzální, že věříme, že každý člověk na světě by měl, nebo jeho kulturní projev by měl být nějak respektován a jeho sociální pozice by měla být respektována a podobně. A k tomu potřebujeme zohlednit partikulární situace různých lidí, ale ano, zároveň pokud to znamená, že máme zájem o partikulární jevy a lidí, je taky potřeba, jsou univerzalistické předpoklady, které musíme, i když jsou jenom provizorní, musíme využívat. Když chceme vystupovat z jednoho kontextu a něco tvrdit o jiné partikularitě, která je mimo náš původní kontext. Ano, potřebujeme to a právě je to takový kruh, který se v ideálním případě aspoň neustále koriguje.
Díky za zodpovězení.
Tak, moc děkuji. Máme tady dvě otázky. Já se dívám teďka na hodinky, máme 10:36, 45 začínají panely. Já bych možná si dovolil asi už jenom umožnit prostor pouze pro jednu a v pořadí tady byl tedy Jakub Marek, takže poprosím Jakuba Marka, aby se zeptal.
Já nevím teď, jestli jsem vidět, jakože nejsem vidět.
Vidět nejste, ale slyšíme vás, takže...
Tak to se omlouvám, nevím, proč mi to teďka ta kamera nezafungovala, ale... Jo, aha, tak to je krytka. Dobré dopoledne, já moc děkuju za přednášku. Já jsem si to poslechl nejenom rád, ale vlastně jsem jako neantropolog, ale jako filozof, nebo doufám aspoň trošičku antropolog, že jsem to tak trochu taky studoval, tak jsem se sem přihlásil právě proto, abych si poslechnul tuhletu dopolední přednášku. Tak jak říkal Tomáš Samek, jak se tady ozývá pořád dokola, tak já vlastně zápasím přesně s tím samým problémem, a sice s tou komunikací přes ten hiatus filozofie a ať už kulturní nebo sociální antropologie. Nechci to tady zdržovat, chtěl jsem jenom jako svůj takový postřeh nebo zkušenost s touhle otázkou říct, že pro mě možná taky je trochu jako složitý vyrovnávat se s tím nárokem univerzalismu nebo toho řekněme, abych to řekl, Gadamer předpokládá, že máme jakýsi předchůdné srozumění spolu, že prostě si rozumíme vždycky a že neporozumění jenom výrazem toho předchůdního porozumění. A já s tímhletím trochu zápasím. Pro mě totiž kulturní antropologie byla velká zkušenost toho, že musíme připustit možnost právě jiného. A že naopak filozofie vždycky v tom svém zápasu, jakýsi metajazyk, metamyšlení se snaží tuhletu jinakost zrušit. A to, co by mě prostě jenom zajímalo, je, jestli v dnešní době třeba i na úrovni filozofie se nesetkáváme s jako rozpadem tohoto projektu společného myšlení, protože když to řeknu konkrétně, tak vlastně se ukazuje, že začínají se objevovat tendence, že sociální zkušenost brání stejnému porozumění nebo stejnému nějaké komunikaci. Například hnutí Black Lives Matter na univerzitách vlastně nakonec, tak jak jsem měl i zkušenost se s tím potkat, je výrazem toho, že prostě myslíme jinak. Jo? A že musíme tuhletu jinakost nějakým způsobem dokázat respektovat. A proto by mě zajímalo, jestli ten nárok toho univerzalismu vlastně nakonec trochu nejde proti tomu, co já chápu jako takhle významný impuls antropologie, to znamená dokázat se vyrovnat s tou jinakostí myšlení. Děkuju.
No, tak děkuju. Čas běží, tak já bych jenom řekl, že myslím, že velká výzva je právě hledat, jak přes jinakost najít nějaké porozumění, které, i když víme, že to není úplné a absolutní. A že právě v tom spočívá, myslím, že něco, co je společné antropologii i filozofii. Ta snaha o porozumění přes jinakost.
Dobře, já si zase dovolím, já tady bohužel budu mít takovou nevděčnou roli toho nudného hlídače času a podobně. Byly tady další ještě otazy, hlásil se Martin Švantner, myslím, že bychom měli určitě řadu ještě zajímavých věcí. Bohužel jsme trošku tlačení, ve 45 by měli začínat panely, tak aby měli lidi aspoň chvilinku nějakým způsobem si se občerstvit nebo si odskočit. Takže já bych si dovolil za naši asociaci velmi poděkovat za zajímavou přednášku. Děkuji i ostatním za reakce. A teďka bych asi odstartoval tu pauzu, kterou máme, a potom vlastně se můžete přes ty breakout rooms, které je vlastně tlačítko dole, se můžete potom hlásit do dalších panelů. Děkuji vám.
Děkuji všem za poslech, za otázky.